and we decided to interview Israelis and Palestinians who drink ayahuasca together. These are groups that we did not organize. We just observed them, we interviewed, I participated in some of them. So it's observational research. And the way we started it was a road trip together with Antoine Saka, who was a Palestinian peace activist, in which we interviewed many Israelis and Palestinians who joined these ceremonies. And Natalie Ginsberg from MAPS has also joined us for a few of those interviews. And in this road trip, we had a month-long kind of condensed and asking many people about questions and trying to find themes of the experiences that happen in them. The population that we interviewed were 18 Israelis and 13 Palestinians, so 31 in total, gender balanced. And the context was mostly ayahuasca ceremonies in Israel and Palestine, but also abroad in Europe and Brazil. So the context was also the people did not gather for peace building or conflict resolution or reconciliation. It just happens to be that the context is kind of mixed. So people go with the regular intentions behind ayahuasca for Western people, which is at least psycho-spiritual growth and personal kind of personal growth or personal therapy. But because the context is quite unique and because the context is mixed, even if the intentions were like this, the context has provided something else. And we were interested to see what happens in this context. And this is kind of the 101 of psychedelic research, is that context affects the experience. So we interviewed, almost every interview was around 2 hours, very deep personal stories, very meaningful process for all of us as interviewers as well. And engaging in micro-phenomenology interview in moments in which there was a need to focus on the experience. And then later on using grounded theory in order to find the themes from people's experiences and from people's processes. So grounded theory is trying to promote this kind of bottom-up coding of the interviews and not necessarily imposing an hypothesis or a certain theory on it, but try to really listen to what people have to say and find the themes from there. So I'll mention 3 themes now. These were themes that were published in a paper a few months ago. And this is mainly a focus on the experience itself and not necessarily on the outcomes or the changes that happen after the experiences. So the themes which we published, and I will go through them, were kind of the experience of oneness or unitive experience, identity dissolution. So connecting as human to human, kind of beyond the conflict. And the second theme was actually kind of the counter theme to that, was experiencing a connection based on the other culture, based on differences, so a recognition. And the third theme was conflict-related revelation. So people had visions or insights, but mainly visions, visual visions, which related to collective trauma or intergenerational trauma, or the trauma of the land, or seeing the other side. So becoming the other side, the Israeli becoming a Palestinian, and seeing the Palestinian thing. So these were the 3 themes. The unitive experience as a group was kind of the most obvious one, and it was the first one that everybody told us about, and it was very much fitting also the ideology of the observed groups. So this is the ideology of kind of a new age or Western psychedelic culture at large, in which there's a kind of a focus on universality, a focus on kind of humanity, humanism, and the idea of a human-to-human connection. So, for example, a Palestinian woman said that in the ceremony, all the identities, they peel: Israeli, Palestinian, Muslim, Jewish, Christian. It all sheds to the floor, and all is left is love and acceptance of the interviewees. And it kind of reminds also of the idea of Communitas, or the kind of collective group experience. So I'll just move for a moment to slides and show you something from a different research. Share screen. So this is 2 slides from another research we published a few months ago, led by Hannes Kettner, and I supervised this. This is a research of 500 individuals going into retreats, not related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but going into retreats mainly for personal processes, but we researched the kind of collective experiences that happened in those retreats. We call this Communitas survey or questionnaire, and this is based on the theory of Victor and Edith Turner, suggesting that in rituals, there are moments in which social hierarchies, social identities collapse, and shared humanity is experienced. So this is not just in psychedelic rituals. Victor Turner suggested this. He found it first in rituals in Africa, but then they explore it in many other rituals and also in spontaneous situations, such as revolutions, for example, or natural disasters. Suddenly something else is happening and new people connect on a different basis. People say there's like magic in the air in these moments. So you can see here questions like, during the ceremony, I felt a sense of belonging with the other participants, a sense of harmony, and a sense of sharing. And we can see here from the same study that Communitas was happening during the retreats, and Communitas was predicted in a model that kind of incorporates what was happening before the session and what was happening after. We can see that the rapport with a fellow group and the rapport with the facilitators was helping promoting the experience of Communitas under the influence of mushrooms and ayahuasca in this study. And then that led also to a feeling of Communitas in the retreat and more willing to share with each other deep kind of processes that people went through. So self-disclosure, and that eventually led to more psychological well-being and social connectedness. So going back to the presentation now. So just a moment. So we saw that. We actually saw Communitas. We saw human-to-human connection and a very strong love between participants. But it didn't stay there, and we didn't just see connection beyond identities. I actually think if that was the only thing that we would see, it would be quite problematic. So the second theme that many people reported was recognition of the otherness or recognition of differences, and actually a deep connection, a deep spiritual connection, which is based on differences. So kind of the regular narrative that we heard from many participants was listening to music or prayers of the other. So for example, Israeli that listening to Arabic music sang by a Palestinian woman in the ceremony. And many say that these moments, they start with resistance, they start with fear. There's a tense energy in these moments. They actually raise the anger and the fear of the conflict. For example, a Palestinian woman said that she was afraid of being brainwashed by Jewish participants, or a Jewish woman that said that it kind of ignited very much fear of them, or fear that they might, Palestinians might hurt her. So it kind of really stirs up these like narratives and identities that we were educated with. So it starts with the resistance in the beginning, but for example, a Palestinian facilitator said that resistance is the thing that we actually work with. Resistance means that there's something bubbling, there's something that wants to come out, and we need to learn how to work with resistance. So when resistance is solved, there's usually a strong connection through music or prayer to the culture of the other, to the other people. And that can bring people into a feeling of expansion or awe or reverence. So many people use the word expansion to describe these moments. In the local jargon, it means moving into a collective process, that something special has happened. People even say that they kind of moving from personal processes, from being very internal. In these moments, something very unique happened, and people expand with their chests and suddenly being aware to the fellow group members and knowing that something very unique has happened in these moments. And what is kind of unique is interesting. I'll try to explain it soon, but I'll show you just another slide for a moment, quoting an Israeli woman, and share screen. Okay, so I'll quote an Israeli woman discussing these moments. When someone is saying Allah Akbar in a ceremony, one can feel how the room is flooded with love and how people burst the limits of their normal consciousness and connect to something beyond. It is a moment of great expansion when we are in a group, in a moment that takes us away from our regular frameworks, from our regular life, and transcends us to another insight, and puts in the container something that was there, but that we did not pay attention to. And suddenly, when everyone feels it and connects to more truth, to more love, then it expands the container of the group. This is a huge process of healing, in my opinion. So you saw there those kind of words of insights and expansion of consciousness and expanding of the container. So what I like to argue is that there's a moment. What does it mean? There's awe in these moments, and why there's awe. Awe is an emotion which is usually associated, needs two things in order for it to happen. It needs vastness, something very big, and it needs to not be able to be accommodated by our regular mental structures, which means it needs to be a surprising moment. Okay, so it's a big surprise creates awe. And this is from our research. So why listening to the music of the other can create such a big surprise? And I would argue that these kind of moments of recognition are similar to recognition of the beauty of the other culture, of the music of the other culture, and maybe even of the injustice that's done to, like if it's Israeli listening to Arabic, the injustice that is done on Palestinian people. And suddenly having that insight or seeing the pain of Palestinian people through the music can actually change or shift the narratives, the regular structure, the regular identity. And that's why it creates awe, because it wasn't accommodated in our previous mental structure. It was something new. It's a new connection to happen to Arabic music or Palestinian music in these moments. So there's a really strong shift of identities in these moments, of the connection to the other culture through this music. So because of that, that in these moments, social identities are challenged and something new is revealed to participants. So these are the kind of two themes. Both are themes of connection. They're themes of connection human to human, of love to human, and connection based on difference of connecting to the other in a way. But the problem here, and this is kind of a problem that we engaged very much from the beginning of this research, is that it's not just psychedelics. Obviously, they create these moments of harmony, of love, but the conflict is not just about creating love between enemies. That's not the only way to solve it, especially in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is asymmetrical. This means that the conflict is Israeli-occupied Palestinian. There's a definite injustice happening to Palestinians. There's a strong asymmetry of power. So just creating harmony between participants doesn't necessarily change reality outside. So one of the Palestinian participants, for example, said, I cannot go to a checkpoint and I'm a human, I'm a spiritual human being, I'm a light being, let me go through. Right? It doesn't work like that. His spiritual enlightenment doesn't necessarily help him going through checkpoints. He also said, I cannot heal trauma as trauma is ongoing. So if this kind of spiritual conversation or the psychedelic conversation of peace work is of healing the traumas of the past, it's also an issue of the traumas are not just of the past. There is day-to-day injustice happening. There's day-to-day trauma. Trauma is continuous and complex. So that Palestinian guy said, all I can do is dig some trauma out once in a while, but I'll need to continue engaging with this type of healing as long as the trauma is happening on a day-to-day basis. So as I said, the conflict is asymmetrical, and this is kind of a known problem from research on conflict resolution. Some say it's the tension between harmony and liberation. For example, many times the ones in power, for example, Israelis, when they meet Palestinians, they want to connect individual into individual. They don't want to speak about the conflict or about the collectives. They just want to connect human to human. While Palestinians, when they come to this contact in conflict resolution, they want to speak about decolonization, about injustice, about inequality or the need to achieve equality. And they want to represent the collective. They want to speak as the collective. This is usually the first tension that happens in conflict resolution groups. So there's a tension between the need to create harmony in the group, but also the need to actually liberate, create equality in real life. So few peace researchers call it the irony in harmony. So creating harmony in a small group context can create illusion of equality, which can actually prevent real life action afterwards that would challenge the inequality that exists in real life. So most of the groups that we observed were very apolitical and very kind of harmony oriented. So after a few interviews, me and Antoine, in a road trip, we kind of came back at midnight to the car, and we both felt quite uncomfortable with what we heard from people. So we heard beautiful stories of love and connection, but we felt also a very apolitical disengagement from the conflict. So both me and Antoine were holding our heads, didn't know what the other is thinking, and we shared it with each other, and we shared this like issue with each other, and that issue became one of the kind of main thing that we're exploring in our research. So now I'll argue that there's another element of the psychedelic molecules, which is liberating or rebellious or revolutionary. And this is something quite provocative, I might argue here. So we know that there's a historical use. Sorry, there's questions, but I'll ask them. I'll answer in the end. So we know that the historical use of psychedelics sometimes is political. Obviously, the 60s has a kind of a rebellious character in them, a rebellious anti-establishment character in them. Ayahuasca in the Amazon has been developed under colonization. So colonization happens for 400 years, and local communities, indigenous and mestizo communities, many times use ayahuasca in a belief that they're opposing white colonizers, and the same with peyote in North America. So the peyote cults of 120 years ago, and that continued to the Native American church, a lot of times the practice was related to opposition to white colonization. So there are historical examples in which psychedelics visions that regardless of psychedelics can create a certain revolutionary motion. So the idea of like a prophet that starts from a revelation to revolution. So we heard few of these processes from some of our interviews, which is not just about the vision, and usually these were traumatic visions, visions of injustice, of conflict, of pain, and that they create a certain motion afterwards in which a person tries to change material reality as well. So an example is the story of Ruqayya. Ruqayya is a Palestinian woman living in Israel, quite assimilated to Israeli culture and the Israeli state. So in a way, there's something hidden in her. There's a Palestinianhood which is a bit in conflict with herself. In one hand, she's a Palestinian. In one hand, she very much wants to be part of the Israeli culture, and there's a tension in her. So she sits in a ceremony in Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is the holiest day for Jewish operation of atonement, in which sins are considered and forgiveness is asked. And in this ceremony, she's one of the only Palestinians in the ceremony, a ceremony which is mainly Jewish. And suddenly she has a strong revelation in the ceremony. In that revelation, she begins with a vision of her daughter falling into the abyss, the darkness, and her, Ruqayya, trying to take her hand and pull her daughter from the abyss. And her daughter at the same time was considering to join the Israeli army, was also fasting in Yom Kippur with her Jewish friend, and Ruqayya felt that she's losing her daughter to kind of to the Israeli side in a way. So she pulls that and she saves her in her vision from the darkness. And then a strong vision happens, and in which she sees the pain of the land. She feels the pain of the land. She sees cycles of war happening. She sees mother who sacrificed her own children to the land. She sees the blood that going into the land. And this is a story that actually 4 Palestinian women told us, that they saw the blood going into the land. And this is kind of an eco-feminist interpretation also of the conflict behind it, suggesting that the suffering is the land comes from these 2 nations fighting over it. And there's a connection here between the Pachamama kind of spiritual New Age ideology, very, very ecological one, and anti-war in Israel. So it's kind of, it comes together. So she feels this pain of the land, and she's filled suddenly with anger. And she says she almost uncontrollably, as if she became a messenger of this, she releases the frequency of anger. and she sings the opening paragraph of the Quran in this moment in an angry way. And this is something that was common to the other kind of revelation to revolution, let's say, processes that we observed, in which anger is ignited in the ceremony through a revelation. And through that anger, she tries to shift the awareness of people in the ceremony. She tries to tell, through her singing, through her anger, that forgiveness and reparation is not just to the Jewish people, it's not just about fasting, but it's also a political correction of the injustice that is happening to Palestinian people. And she kind of tries to bring that energy to the ceremony. But she says that not everybody understands her and not everybody really engaging with her message, though few did, and those few followed her in ceremonies that she facilitated later and became her helpers or musicians that kind of follow her. So it's hard for her now. She's kind of part of a social milieu which is very much about harmony and very much trying to suppress angry, conflictual energies. But she says that in this moment, something that's also universal was revealed to her. It was about the oppression and injustice that happens to Palestinian people, but it's universal. It's about the human spirit. It's about love to humanity at large. And the kind of process of liberating Palestinians is not part of this of identity politics, which is related to Palestinianhood, but it's about of a way of engaging with humanity in large, and the case that right now that Palestinians are the ones that being oppressed. So the liberation of Palestinians is a universal mission for her now in life, and she tries to do it through ceremonies, through educating people about Arabic, through engaging with the Arabic music, but also with finding like-minded people which try to play with this kind of connection between spiritual practices and between political understandings. So slowly she changes the reality around her, and she, for example, in a ceremony 2 years later, after slowly engaging with these kind of ideas, she has a moment of inspiration, and she speaks to the in a group that was actually gathered for that reason with a more political intention, and she speaks to the group in a moment of inspiration in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, and she speaks about the children of Israel who were occupied by or oppressed by Pharaoh and were liberated by Moses, and then oppressed now Palestinians. So those Jewish people who celebrate the liberation from oppression in every holiday are now becoming an oppressor. And she speaks it in a very spiritual language, and in a way finding a way to incorporate a political message within a spiritual practice that sometimes does not manage to incorporate that. So this is a unique process that's happening to her through that kind of initial moment, initial rupture of the revelation. But the people around the structure can always oppose that, the spiritual structure, the New Age structure, by oppose political forces, let's say, by fetishizing three things. So it can fetishize harmony, and by fetishizing harmony, you suppress conflict, and sometimes conflict is actually needed. By fetishizing universalism, you can suppress the need to discuss differences and the conflict that's related to differences. And by fetishizing personal process, you can deny the need for collective work for liberating larger society. So the conclusion, can psychedelics be used for peace building? This is kind of the initial question we entered this research with. We think that there is a potential. The potential is complex, of course. Yes, harmonization, creating friendship, creating love is important. But if that is too much of the focus, then it can actually prevent change and serve the status quo. And igniting a revolutionary, rebellious spirit is also something that can actually oppose the status quo and can be part of a peace building practice. Obviously, it also has its drawbacks and needs to be integrated wisely. So the idea of whether psychedelic peace building happens in the future is to work in dialogue, in action. So means by meeting each other, by challenging each other with each other's narrative, by meeting the other, you create a space in which dialogue is happening and political awareness is created. And therefore, psychedelic experiences already come with this political awareness. So if Israelis, let's say, don't meet Palestinians and think about psychedelic peace, they would only think about the kind of the harmony, the oneness, and they will not be challenged by the injustice that's happened to Palestinians. So dialogue in action create a political awareness, and then the most important part is from that awareness, from the reflection, from the dialogue, create action that try to change society at large. So this is something we kind of hope to do in the future, and something we're engaging in right now in the kind of continuation of the research. So that's it. I would like to thank again Natalie and Antoine, so Natalie Ginsburg and Antoine Saka, who were involved in the inception of the study and in the observational study and in doing the interviews of Iftach Lon from Hebrew University, Lisa Luan from Imperial College, Rick Dublin, and Robin Carhart-Harris for being co-authors in the paper that was just published. And to Nadim Karkabi, a Palestinian anthropologist from the University of Haifa, for a paper that we submitted but it's not published yet about the kind of revolutionary spirit. And to Moshe Tov Krebs and MAPS for their support, financial and intellectual support of this observational research, and to Kristen Angermeyer for his support for the continuation and future research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk on a topic that probably couldn't be more timely. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Let us move right into the questions, out of which we have a couple. Unfortunately, dear audience, we will not be able to address all of them. But about the methodology of your study, I think it's very easy. It's most easy to answer. How were your participants recruited? How did the sampling take place?
Yeah, so mainly rolling. So I'm Israeli. I knew a few people. I kind of know the scene. So in the beginning, people heard that I'm interested in kind of this direction, and people approached me and told me about these groups. And then I decided to first work on observational research, and had a few directions. And from each interviewer, I continued to the next interviewer. So once trust is kind of built in the interview process, then I was recommended to go to other people. But there's definitely like a self-selecting bias here of people who also want to speak about psychedelics for peace, and not always. I'm aware of also groups of like Israeli settlers who drink ayahuasca together, and does not necessarily engage in like ending the occupation or things like this. It actually can promote even right-wing ideology. So the groups were very specific contexts in which we were interested in. Yeah.
Okay, that's very clear. On the other end of that group, the facilitators, those that administered the substance, the ayahuasca, that oversaw the ceremony, in some contexts we would talk about shamans or the curanderos. Who were they, and how familiar were they with the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis?
Yeah. So yeah, first of all, apologize. I was supposed to say it in the beginning, like it is a very basic stuff. Most of the facilitators were Israeli. There was one Palestinian facilitator, and there was one European facilitator. I think there is an awareness of the conflict, but there's like also within the, so I'm talking about 5 groups in which we studied. There's awareness of the conflict, but there's, in my opinion, a bit of like this kind of naive awareness sometimes of the conflict, in which just like the kind of idea of peeling identities is the dominated one in the ideology, and therefore there's a lot of engagement in like in politics. They're very apolitical in nature, like hold a very strong apolitical ideology. So that can, if the Israeli facilitator is like this can kind of serve in a way hegemonic structures, because it doesn't necessarily challenge the injustice. It just creates a harmony between group members.
Very good. Thank you so much. That was valuable additional information, and there's a lot more that I would like to know. Our audience also has more questions. If you want, you can still answer some in written. Otherwise, we might continue the discussion at another point at another time, because due to time constraints, we have to move on. Thank you so much for your talk, Leor. It was a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.